Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. I am Matthias Plätz. I am a physician, a professor for infectious diseases, and also the president of the Swiss, Austrian, German Paul-Ehrlich Society for Anti-Infective Chemotherapy. And I welcome you to a workshop on a very important topic, that is development of a sustainable market for new resistance-breaking antibiotics. This workshop is hosted by the Association of Research-Based Pharmaceutical Companies and the German Network Against Antimicrobial Resistance. This network concludes basic scientists from the German Center for Infection Research, scientific societies, and also companies that still do the job to develop novel antibiotics. So, why is this an important topic? You remember that antibiotics are in clinical usage for just 80 years. In the 1940s, we started with penicillin, but a couple of years ago, the WHO declared antibiotic resistance a public health crisis. And I think there is even a better term. I do not know if you came across this paper. This was published last year on the Lancet Infectious Diseases. This is actually the highest ranked infectious disease journal in the medical literature. And an international consortium of scientists tried to estimate the death toll due to antibiotic resistance in the year 2019. One of the authors is also in the room. I've seen Tom Ekman. And the idea here was that they did it very restrictively. So they counted only those deaths that were really not with an infection, but due to the infection. And what you can see here is that it's not only a problem of Europe or North America. In fact, the highest burden of resistance is actually in West Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia. So this is really a global problem, and we can discuss later why do we have such a problem also in developing countries. And 1.27 million deaths were actually more deaths than caused by COVID in the first year of the pandemic, but no one really took notice of that. Before we start with our talks, I also want to understand something very basic, very principle. That is that we will never solve the issue of antibiotic resistance finally. Because antibiotic resistance is bacterial evolution, and evolution is unstoppable. So this is a continuous fight, and that means we need a continuous flow of novel antibiotics. And maybe many of you have seen this brief video clip. It's just 2 minutes. But I like it. I show it to my students. It's very intuitive. That was done by a Harvard research group. And what they did, they took a long Petri dish, and then they divided the Petri dish in several regions. And they started, here was no, in the margins, there was no antibiotic. Here was the one-fold concentration of an antibiotic that could kill the bacteria. Then there was the 10-fold concentration, the 100-fold concentration. This was already so high that you would also kill the patient. And in the middle, there was the 1,000-fold concentration. And what you can see here, bacteria are light, so you can see how they grow. And always, when they come to the barrier of the next higher concentration, 10-fold higher concentration, there are some successful clones, like we have seen with COVID. Some successful clones that can jump over the barrier and grow further. And after, I think it was 11 days, they reached the 1,000-fold concentration in the lab, the 1,000-fold concentration. And this underlines that we really need novel antibiotics continuously to treat our patients with infectious diseases. We ask ourselves the question, how long does an antibiotic last after it's introduced into the market? And the problem is surveillance studies started in the late 1980s or 1990s. So we do not really know what was going on from the 1940s to the 1990s, the first 50 years of antibiotic usage. And a bright postdoc in my group had the idea. He was coding an algorithm that analyzed 24 million scientific papers out of PubMed back to the 1940s. And then he calculated the time lag between the introduction of an antibiotic into the market and sudden, significant, substantial increase in publications on its resistance. So that means at this time resistance has obviously become a problem. And with this method, we saw that between 10 to 15 years after the introduction of a novel antibiotic, resistance is increasing to a degree that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution anymore. So what is the storyline for our workshop? We want to show different perspectives on the problem. We will start with Dr. Leslie Ogilvie, who will have more a PhD perspective, fostering basic research for novel antibiotics. Then we will hear Mike Gitzinger, and from Mike Gitzinger I learned that 80% of the companies that nowadays still develop novel antibiotics are actually small companies, from 5 to 50 employees with a very short financial perspective. And this actually means that we currently leave the development of treatment to the third leading cause of death on this planet. After cardiovascular disease, after cancer, the third leading cause of death is infectious diseases, to some few idealistic people that do not get sufficient support at the moment. So he will share the obstacles he has to face as the CEO of one of the companies that still develops antibiotics. Then Professor Kevin Utterson, he's a professor for health law at the Boston University, and he will give us a broad overview on the pull and push mechanisms, how we can stimulate the industry still to develop antibiotics. And he will also talk about the CARB-X that helps compounds to come to the bedside. And finally, Gel Dennis from Public Health Canada, he will give us what I would call best practice example, because Canada has decided for a certain mechanism and now they are going to implement it, and he will share his experience with us. So this was enough for the introduction. I'm happy to announce the first speaker. This is Dr. Leslie Ogilvie, and she has a PhD in microbiology and has worked, I've seen in your CV, more than 15 years with antimicrobial resistance in prestigious institutions like the Max Planck Institute, so she knows also the evolutionary perspective. But now she's the director of the global AMR hub for research and development, and you will explain us what this is.
So it's working, that's great. So thank you very much, Matthias, for that kind introduction. My name is Leslie Ogilvie. I'm the director at the Secretariat at the Global AMR R&D Hub, and we're a global partnership that looks to enhance collaboration and coordination in AMR R&D. And today I'm going to talk a bit about the challenges, the opportunities that we have across this landscape of research and development in antibiotic and antibacterial development in general. So when Matthias told me that he was going to show you this amazing video of the development of bacterial resistance on these agar plates, I was really excited because I'm a lab scientist as well, so it really resonated with me. But it also made me think about this BBC Storyworks video that I'd just been watching called Race Against Resistance, and that's what we saw in that video in a sense. But I'm showing you this because in AMR we're told that we have a communication problem, that it's a way too complex phenomena to actually be understood by most people, to grasp the severity of it. But the simple facts are that in 2019, 1.27 million people died of drug-resistant infections. 1 in 5 of those deaths were children under the age of 5 years old. And also, most of the severe effects were in low and middle income countries. And added to this, we have a very weak development pipeline of life-saving drugs, so the antibiotics and the antibacterials that really form the basis of modern medicine. So these are an essential part of our toolkit to mitigate the impacts of AMR in general. So anything that can shine a very bright light on the scale, the urgency, and the challenge that we're facing in terms of developing new antibiotics and antibacterials is worth flagging up. So if you have 30 minutes spare in your schedule any day, please go and look this video up on YouTube and have a watch and maybe learn something about the scale of the problem. The documentary really drives home that we are losing the race against resistance. To put this in perspective, in oncology, in clinical development, there's thousands of drugs in process. But for antibacterials, there's only 77. And this is despite the fact that cancer patients really need antibiotics to help resist life-threatening infections. WHO have done an analysis of the antibacterial pipeline, and they tell us that of these 77 antibacterials, most of them are in early phases of development. So patients won't be seeing these for a long time. The WHO analysis also tells us that most of the antibiotics in development at the moment are derivatives of existing antibiotic classes. So there's already well-established mechanisms of resistance circulating in the environment. So given that status, WHO is sounding the alarm and telling us that the current pipeline is insufficient to address the challenge of AMR. So why is it so difficult to develop antibiotics? Well, for one thing, we know it's scientifically challenging. It's hard to find new ways to actually tackle these dangerous pathogens, especially gram-negative pathogens. We know that research and development is very expensive, so some estimates say between $1 and $2 billion US dollars. And we know it takes a long time, so between 10 and 15 years. Once you go through all that process and you have a product at the end of it, a successful product, then you can't actually sell much of that product because newly approved antibiotics are kept in reserve. And that's to reduce the likelihood of resistance developing. So clinicians only use these reserve antibiotics for the most severe and the most critical resistant infections. This all adds up to the fact that there's a low return on investment. The development process is so costly, you can't sell a lot of product, and you end up being able to not be able to recoup the costs of the development, manufacturing, and distribution of your product. These dynamics have led to many global pharmaceutical companies exiting the field and leaving behind many small and micro-sized companies feeling very vulnerable in their situation in terms of how do they sustain their operations. So companies besides 7 of the 18 antibiotics approved in the last 10 years have actually become bankrupt. So this is definitely a market failure, but it's also a public health failure because we're not developing the life-saving drugs that we need to address public health needs. So what can we do to mitigate those challenges? We know that push funding helps, and push funding is financial or other interventions which help to support research and development by directly lowering the cost of development. But what we can do at the hub is integrate all the information on the investments going into new antibacterials and antibiotics that have been funded through public and philanthropic sources since 2017. And what we see is a very significant flow of investment into this area, into new antibacterials across the discovery and development stages, with significant funding from countries such as the US, the UK, the European Union, Germany as well, amongst many, many others. What we're also seeing is the establishment of many major international and national programs and global partnerships which are encouraging antibiotic and antibacterial research and development in general. So we have things like the CARB-X and GARD-P really supporting the preclinical and clinical pipeline, but with a razor focus on public health needs and addressing those. But in isolation and at the current scale, we really know that this push funding is insufficient to develop those products that we really need to address priority health needs. We actually need policies in addition to push funding that reward successful research and development, that actually bring products to market that address public health needs and make sure that these products are accessible to all that need them. So pool incentives, of course, are one example of this that reward successful innovation by providing a known return on investment in really creating a much more sustainable and viable market. So in this current climate, we know that we're not going to be able to address the most critical priority needs in AMR. So the Hub has done some studies and asked the question, what are the critical priority needs for addressing AMR at the moment? And if we do develop products addressing those priority needs, what do they do commercially? How do they survive? What happens to them in the market? So we asked our advisory group to tell us what is the priority needs in AMR, and they told us, well, the world should be developing antibiotics with activity against multi-drug resistant bacteria for treatment of bloodstream infections and also pneumonia. And then what we did was modeled how many people will be facing these types of infections by 2040. And in our model, we found around 8.3 million people will be facing these types of infections. And that means there's a large need for new drug treatment options. And again, the burden of infections are occurring in low and middle income countries. When we looked at the commercial potential of these antibiotics, we saw that these antibiotics would not accrue so large revenues and really come to weak financial rewards. And that means that the return on investment isn't particularly attractive for developers or for investors, meaning that in reality, these drugs were likely not to be developed. And this weak financial case has a really strong impact on the accessibility of products. So new antibiotics wouldn't be available in the parts of the world where they're actually most needed. And again, this comes down to many parts of low and middle income countries. So given this landscape, the Hub is coming up with a number of recommendations that we hope that will concretize action against AMR and accelerate the development of new antibiotics and antibacterials. So what we think we should be doing is encouraging alignment and targeted action on financing mechanisms, including push and pull incentives. We really need to strengthen the AMR R&D ecosystem across this development pipeline. So we need much more sustainable, we need much more predictable financing for R&D. And we need to commit to further public-private partnerships. On the pull incentive side, we really need to make sure that they're actually designed to stimulate R&D and not just access. We need to be encouraging the establishment of feasible targets for antimicrobial resistance research and development that are actually informed by public health needs, to give a framework, to give some more predictability in terms of what products will be developed over longer time periods. And of course, we have to prioritize equity and global access to priority antibacterials. This is a global problem, and we need global solutions for this. So I'm going to stop there and say thank you very much for listening, and hand you back to Matthias.
We want to do it this way, that if there are urgent questions, 1 or 2 questions briefly asked directly after the talk, and then we will have a panel discussion for further questions. Are there any immediate questions?
Apologies. Just one question. So my name is Claudia Wilmes. I'm working for Cell, one of the leading biomedical journals. And so I'm wondering, so you're talking about, Thank you. Sorry. My question to you is, you talked about which diseases you're focusing on and how you want to streamline the financing. Are you also focusing on the mode of treatment? Are you focusing on a specific, you think like one approach is superior to another, basically?
No, so at the Hub, we actually just collect information on what research projects are being funded. And in the example that I gave you, we actually consulted an expert advisory group that told us which priorities they thought were the most urgent to tackle at the moment, hence highlighting bloodstream infections and pneumonia. So it's not us at the Hub that actually do the work and do the hard work in the end. We just collect that information and use that to to leverage that to provide policy and recommendation advice to funders and policymakers. If that makes sense.
Further questions? Okay.
Hello? Yeah. My name is Ali Yildiz. I'm from Abbott. Hi. Leslie, I have a question concerning the main driver of antimicrobial resistance. What is the main driver, and what shall we do to tackle this challenge? This is one question. And the second question is, do you have figures or numbers on how many antibiotics we need to, because it's a natural evolvement, it's a natural process, and how many antibiotics are needed to have a sufficient pipeline? Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe I take your second question first, and this is something that one of my panel members will be addressing later, I think, in the session. So I'm going to leave that to Kevin to answer. And in the first question, I think the popular opinion in terms of antimicrobial resistance is that it's overuse and misuse of antibiotics. But I'm sure there's further research on there to see the exact specific drivers of this.
There was a third question. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So I'm Rosa Castro from the DSW, so we are a global health NGO. My question is a bit maybe clarification, but just to hear your thoughts on that. How are you making sure, or which of these mechanisms that you also introduce, the push and the pull, which are needed, will make sure that the antibiotics that will be in the pipeline are the ones that are also addressing the biggest burden, which you mentioned that is in low and middle income countries? Thank you.
That's a big conversation that we need to have with many different stakeholders involved to make sure all perspectives and opinions are addressed. And I don't think there'll be a one-size-fits-all for this problem. I think there'll be many different mechanisms that need to be applied at the same time.
I briefly want to add something to this. I wanted to say it in a panel discussion, but now it fits better. Once I had a student from the Gambia who did his thesis in my institute, and he was investigating antibiotic stewardship. And I was asking him, why do you have such high resistance rates? And he says, we do not have a microbiology. So we get 3 days after we started with antibiotics, sometimes we get something saying there are gram-positive cocci, gram-negative rods, but there's no resistance testing, and antibiotics are cheap, so everyone gets a broad-spectrum antibiotics. And I think this session is very important, but we need a similar session with point-of-care diagnostics that works also in rural areas. I think this goes together with novel antibiotics, that we have a prudent and a tailored use. That's very important. Okay, the very last question then.
Hi, my name is Rico and I'm from Asia Europe Foundation. I understand there is an issue in market model, there is an issue in public health, and then there are so many funding like CAVEX or AMR Action Fund to support research and development. But do we have any initiative that looks after young scientists? Because I had a lot of scientists getting older, then there is a generation gap. So even though we secure funding for research and development from all these global initiatives, if there is no human being who is actually capable of doing that actual work, I don't think money itself really helps us to get out of this shithole in a way. So, but I haven't had a lot of initiative like that to look for future generation. It's the tendency we like to put Band-Aid, not treat cause issues. So I would like to know if there is any initiative for this. Thank you.
Yeah, Rico, I think you highlight some great points there. I mean, I think this brain drain and the lack of expertise is one of a really key point that we have to address now. In terms of funding for programs for this, I know that in America, our board member, Dennis Dixon, always talks about this great great program that he's involved in running for drug development and teaching younger scientists how to go about with different molecular techniques and different skill sets that they need to learn, and passing that generational knowledge over as well. So I know there's some running, but definitely not enough, and not enough funding consideration for teaching the next generation of drug developers.
Okay. Now we come to the next speaker. Already said that I learned a lot from him regarding the small companies, Dr. Mike Gitzinger. He is president of the BEAM Alliance. The BEAM Alliance is a European association representing over 70 European and international SMEs that work with novel antibiotics. And he is also the co-founder and CEO of BioVersus, so he's doing the development by himself. And he will talk about his daily problem.
Thank you, Matthias. Oh, this is loud. Are the slides coming up here? Yes. Maybe? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So, as introduced, I'm also the president of the BEAM Alliance, besides being the CEO of BioVersus, a company that is developing new antibiotics. I will actually, at the end of the talk, quickly come back to that. In the BEAM Alliance, we're not only representing SMEs that develop new antibiotics, but also diagnostics. So actually, it is a holistic view. We need both parts. Now, why are SMEs actually represented here and not large pharmaceutical companies? Well, that has to do with the economics. And as Matthias already said, today, the global antibiotic pipeline is actually to 80% in the hands of small and micro companies, 5 to 50 employees. Much worse than the number of employees is their financial situation. You see that here on the right-hand side. About half of our members do not have a financial runway longer than 1 year. And we're talking about drug development, which normally takes 10 to 15 years to bring one new drug to the market. So this is a disaster that I cannot name stronger than, I'm losing the words beyond disaster, to be honest. And it's really, we are going open eyes in that direction and we don't understand it. And we had the question from the public as well. The talents, the human capital, everyone of a sane mind, and I'm including myself, should actually move on. This is such a difficult field. It's incredible to survive in that field and doesn't always make fun. And you could actually go to different indications and make yourself a career, be developing drugs that everyone needs apparently, like weight loss drugs, etc. But we're still here. So why are we struggling so much? We're struggling because the end of the road is dead. It's broken, it's too small, it's whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the road, we develop an antibiotic that we do so for 10 to 15 years. We go through all the hurdles scientifically and development pass. And in the end, we get potentially a thank you from a regulator and that the drug is approved. But certainly we don't get money. All the last antibiotics have made not more than probably 100 million. That's really the best you can. And just to mention, if you developed your drug from A to Z successfully, you are spending about 300 to 500 million to get it there. And this is all at risk and throughout this long time period. So the market is royally broken and we need to do something. And further, why is the market broken? There's good reasons for it to a certain extent. Part of it is stewardship, and we should be focusing on using these new antibiotics responsibly. No one is saying to go back to volume and so forth. We need to do the right thing, so stewardship is important. We have a generic focused market. Yes, the alternative drugs, the old drugs that still work when you don't have resistance, are very cheap. And all of this is competing and leading to this current economic system that is broken. The issue then for small companies is that we're doing things that we shouldn't even be doing, global phase 3 trials, potentially commercializing ourselves, etc., because the guys that really can do this, large pharma, is not in it anymore. So in the end, what we need is pretty clear. Since about 8-9 years, we have so much research on this. I'm really tired in reading the updates because it's always anyway the same. We need new push incentives. Governments have actually come up with a fair bit. Leslie summarized a bit the numbers, and we'll hear more from Kevin. That's not bad, and it's helpful. Without that, we wouldn't be here, and certainly the 70 that we represent wouldn't be 70, but maybe 7, if that. But the pull mechanisms is what we really lack, and I'm really looking forward to Joel's presentation to show us a little bit how that can be tackled. I come back to it as well. On the push side, we have a few logos here, which is great. CARB-X is certainly the best initiative that we have in this regard, but it's not sufficient. We need more funding on push. We have the industry that came up with the AMR Action Fund, which is also great. Again, it is not enough. But the worst of it all, you can pump as much as you want. If you don't solve the end of the road, it won't be helpful. It will not solve the problem. And it comes back to really, we need the finance to attract the talent, to have the people that develop these drugs, and to make it sustainable. And we understand that it's critical, but I'm not sure that everyone really understands how critical it is. Because every year the numbers of drug-resistant infections grow. It's very simple. And it's nearly a natural law. It won't go away. On the other hand, what goes away is the people that know how to develop drugs and that actually do it. So we have a relatively constant membership in the Beam Alliance. And I was myself wondering, how is that possible because it's so difficult? Well, it's very simple. We have also, thanks to CARB-X, a few young ones that come out of university, highly motivated, fresh with a new idea, until they realize how to finance it. But the later part of the pipeline, that's really, it's dying away. I'm expecting by this year that we have another 5 members that are close to clinic or in clinical trials going bust. It's done. They're gone. These products are gone. And not because the product is bad, because they don't find finance. And I find that a disaster. I repeat that word. So the solutions are on the table. Globally, we can talk about subscription models, Netflix models. Joel will present that in much better than I do. In Europe, since we are here in Berlin, thanks to the not so easy setup of the European Union with 27 member states, we might need something else than subscription models. The solution from the Commission that was proposed is transferable exclusivity. Both of these vehicles work for industry, for the SMEs, probably also for the large companies, as long as they are of the right size, and that's summarized here. What we really need is action. And I failed words because we're talking to the same people since many, many years, always the same stuff. Nothing has changed in the conclusions. We added just more reports, and they come always the same conclusion. Now we need action. Please, we need implementation of pull mechanisms. The size actually matters here. If we are dwarfing it, if it's too small, we're not making an impact. The field will continue to go down, and we're not finding a solution. The right size for a European share is around the 1 billion mark. And again, Kevin will probably say also something to that. And it's not that expensive. That's 1 billion for a new antibiotic. And the strength is certainly in the numbers. We need that fast, and we need multiple of the G7 and extended G7 countries to do that, because without this pull mechanism, also for the countries of the very high burden, meaning the global south and so forth, there's no chance to have access to any new antibiotic, because there is simply none. And now the question is that worth it? Should the public go into this? We have a wonderful report from the CGD here that shows you the investment impact for countries. It's a big size, so private sector alone doesn't probably do it, but it's actually also the return on investors on the public health sector, etc. And I think everyone in this room would put a few dollars down if we get an hour investment 27-1 in 10 years guaranteed. So, but beyond all of these numbers, can I please also remind people that antibiotics, number one, have been one of the most successful drug classes in the world, having really a true impact on global life expectancy. Never before that was actually seen if a new drug class came out. And secondly, out of these 164 antibiotics that were ever approved in the past, 106 are still available. And I would call them public health good, because they cost virtually nothing. They're available in virtually all countries. If there's no access, it's not a monetary problem here. It's actually other infrastructural issues. And they are here, and they save every day millions of lives since 80 years. And now we're here because of a few billion. I'm sorry to make it sound like this, but we're trying to give up on that. And I fail to comprehend. If you want to hear more about this, we have a conference in Basel later in this year, and I want to conclude with one slide that is the pipeline of my own company. And because I'm talking this talk so many times to so many people, I thought I want to make one personal statement here as well. We have a pipeline with 2 assets in phase 2. So this is, for an entrepreneur, really exciting because now we're testing in patients, we're seeing safety and efficacy. And it looks pretty good for these 2 assets. And based on the WHO priority pipeline, we're tackling number 1, which is Acinetobacter baumannii, and we're tackling one that is for ages on there already, tuberculosis, that everyone seems to forget. And we're quite successful. The company has raised so far 70 million in private money, just to also remember that, and only 30 million in public money, so you see a bit the ratios. And you know what? If these phase 2 trials, and they look so far quite okay, are successful, I'm not sure if I'm able to develop that to the patient, because I'm lacking at least 100 million to bring them through phase 3. And I don't know where to get them from in this environment. And I find this extremely sad and even sickening, because we see that we can actually save patients' lives, and we're not allowed to continue. And with this, I really hope that some people in this room help us to make that change happen and bring these pull mechanisms forward, as Joel will talk to us as well about, which is really great that Canada is making a move. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike, for these clear and honest words. Are there questions? One question.
Hi, Andrea Caputo from React. I have a couple of comments and questions, perhaps. One is in general about, it's great to be here and specifically assisting at this dialogue on AMR, and is also the only session in this conference, so I'm wondering why is that, since we saw the data before. One point before was about the narrative, and also the beginning was mentioning the Gram study and 1.27 million deaths, which actually are associated to bacterial infections, so not AMR, but ABR. I didn't hear, maybe we will hear later, about early stages issue in the pipeline and how they're not long-term funding. So when we discuss about how to bring new molecules also to the market, the next stages, we also need to remember that it's academia also doing a lot of work there. And as discussed before, also the PhD projects are sometimes short, so they don't allow for a continuation. So we also need that. Also, what's mentioned before, and perhaps this is a question to everyone, at which stage do you think we should discuss access and equitable, as was mentioned before by Leslie, but also affordable access to medicine? And of course, my opinion is that we should discuss it in the early stages already. And just mentioning that beside the pool incentives that were just mentioned, there are also other options. And there's been several studies also from the Swedish health agencies about milestone prices, which are different kind of pool incentives, and they seem to be successful in the study. So I just want to mention that. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on that?
There was a lot of questions there. I can start commenting a little bit maybe with one that is certainly a big priority, that is access. I think we need to talk access from the very beginning. And I think all the initiatives that are funding, including the players in the field that are still active, are thinking about that quite hard and honestly. So again, I think that if we don't have the means from the G7, from the rich economies, to pay an adequate price to reimburse the innovation that partially the private sector, certainly largely the private sector, has taken for 10 to 15 years at risk, then we have an issue. Then we don't have something to give access to. So I think access must come along with these pull mechanisms. And I think the industry is committed to actually provide access. We have great examples. Today they're not speaking here, but GARD-P is doing with their Secure initiative great work, and there will be others hopefully as well. It is very important to have sustainable access and stewardship, without a question. I think in terms of research, etc., look, in the German network for AMR, we have a lot of basic researchers as well that are represented in there. And basically, they joined this group in asking and seeking the dialogue with the German government also on pull, because what they realize is that no one is interested in their research anymore. because basically if you do research, you discover something new for a new antibiotic or something, and no one is actually willing to take that forward into a meaningful development. Why did you start doing the research? So I think it goes all the way through, unfortunately, in a 360-degree view. We must have somewhat of a functioning market to actually continue to have the innovation and the talent in this space.
I briefly want to add something as a physician and clinical researcher. So what was really impressive to me, if we think about COVID, the pandemics, within 6 months, we had the first clinical studies and results that were telling us that we should not use antivirals in the late phase when the patient is on the ICU, but that we should use steroids in the patient in the ICU. And the steroids decreased the mortality by 30%. The antivirals in the ICU didn't do anything. And later we learned that the antivirals do their job in the very early phase of the infection. So, but this phase 3 trial actually what gave us within, I think, 6 months after start of the pandemic, good ideas how to treat the patients came actually from big platform trials like REMAP-CAP, like Solidarity. And I think these are very powerful tools. In Germany, for instance, we still have sometimes issue with the regulators because I think for them those kind of studies are too complex and they have issues regarding the base statistics behind. But nevertheless, if we could kind of connect those powerful tools, for instance, with small companies, then the phase 3 trial is usually the trial where then the substance doesn't go any further. It's the most expensive, the longest trial, but this could be easily connected, and then we could probably see faster results. But I think this is also that requires the political will to set something like this up, because in UK you have a study nurse in every hospital. They can include patients, and if someone says every patient now goes into this or to that study, then they recruit the patients, thousands of patients within a very short time. But in Germany, we don't have, for instance, the study culture. So every project is set up by its own. You start always from scratch. You have no money. We talked about personnel. You have no money to finance the study nurses. So you need a permanent contract for those, because these are also experts. And I think here is something what we really could do much better and bring the small companies together with those powerful platform trials. But just as an idea that just came because you asked it. So, further questions? Okay, then we come to our one. Sorry.
Hi. Well, thank you very much first for being here and for being part of this movement that is so relevant right now. And so, you guys, you talk about public health policies and about how to approach that critical component that is a stewardships and aid, and not only public but also private. And it's clearly for like the rest of the people who are involved in this, like younger researchers, we're far from that. We're far from accomplish some deal with the government and so on. But then the question is, what can the rest of the people involved in this great big problem? Academics from all spheres involved in public health. Is that really something that we can do from our jobs? For example, I have clearly failed on trying to convince my mother to stop taking clarithromycin for a flu or something like that. But that's the question.
It's a good one. I think that we can certainly all contribute to this by actually sharing also the narrative and trying to explain the order of magnitude of the problem. On the one hand, not to doom antibiotics, because sometimes you have the opposite, that people now go, oh, I hate antibiotics, they're so bad, we cannot use them at all. I think antibiotics are great drugs, and if appropriately used, they're actually helping patients, and that's good. Overuse, on the other hand, is not good. So I think helping that narrative, and there's great documentaries, I think Leslie cited already the BBC documentary, etc. Making the public aware why this is important is really important, because we don't have patient advocacy groups much in AMR. My unfortunately cynical comment to that is probably that the patients die too fast, and that means that there's not a long-term suffering with the relatives, etc. So that's maybe one explanation why we don't have a lot of advocacy groups. But all of us speaking about it, how important these drugs are, I think, is important.
One more question. Last one, please.
I'm Dr. Jean-Paul from Maltese International. I listen, you say that it is difficult to develop antibiotic, and also you say the IMR increase in Europe for almost 20%. I think now we could go to the prevention to minimize the resource, and for the prevention we could work together within one health approach to make the prevention for the health, prevention for animal, because in livestock we have many irrational prescription of antibiotic in the livestock, and also we can try to reduce the MR in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. This was a very important comment. So antibiotic consumption is the main driver of resistance, and antibiotic in livestock is certainly something this would be worth a separate session. But I think here the politicians have already started to see the problem and have make rules. So the consumption, I'm not a veterinary physician, but I know when I talk with colleagues that the rules are getting stricter. We are not there yet where we need to be, but I think they start already to regulate this, at least in the European Union. Further comments? So then we would move on to the third speaker. I'm happy to announce Professor Kevin Utterson. He is a professor for health law at the Boston University, and he's also the founder and the executive officer of XCARB, and he will tell us what this is.
All right, so this panel has both bad news and good news. The bad news is that 1.27 million people are dying, and that we are actually at risk of losing the effectiveness of the best drug class we've ever seen. The good news is that there's a lot of consensus actually on what the solutions are, and among the panel, but also with all the experts outside of the room. But I'm going to start with a little bit of bad news. So this is these companies represent the small enterprises that have brought an antibiotic to the market in the past decade. These 7 companies represent 7 antibiotics that are licensed and 1 antibiotic that's in phase 3. And of these 7 companies, you have to understand that 280 projects spun out of universities, 280 had hit to lead to end up with this number of projects at the end of the day. And this isn't a cherry-picked sample, this is all of them. And so what happened to those companies? Well, these 3 have actually filed for bankruptcy, or in the previous case, going into liquidation, which is essentially the same thing. And the rest of them have had a distressed sale or significant layoffs. And the result, all total, is that this group has burned through $3.6 billion. The investors have lost. Believe me, the other investors noticed this. This is why Mark is finding it difficult to take 2 excellent phase 2 projects and to find funding for phase 3 once he gets the readout on its phase 2. There was a question earlier about the scientists. You know, what's that, all this gray hair, right? So I looked at, this is not published yet, I looked at all of the scientists at those companies that were on that previous slide, plus one other company that had announced layoffs as well, and asked them for all of their master's, PhD, and MD scientists who spent more than half their time on antimicrobial resistance on June of 2018. And there was 314 individuals. And then I asked the same people, well, where are these people now, right? And it's normal for people to move about within biotech, but of these, 82% of them had completely left antibiotics. They'd either retired or gone on to immune oncology or something else where there was more money, okay? 82% gone. Okay, that's an amazing erosion of the base from the people who actually brought the majority of antibiotics to the market over the past 7 or 8 years. There's still 16% left. I guess they work for Mark and the other companies supported by Carbex. Those 2% in the antibiotics that went to nonprofit, that's 6 individuals. A couple of them work for Carbex, a couple of them work for GARD-P. Okay? So this is the house is on fire sort of piece of data. So let's talk a little bit about the funding gap. So WHO and many others have looked at this. The AMR Action Fund, this private initiative, these were AMR, antibiotic experts. When they looked at the clinical pipeline, it was weaker than they thought. That's what Henry Skinner has said. When the WHO has looked at it, they also find the clinical pipeline very weak. The preclinical pipeline, where Carbex works, has more diversity, more strength in it. But the question is the question Mark posed: what's going to happen later? When do they get funded later, and how does that get to the market? But the preclinical pipeline is also very precarious. These are tiny companies operating on a shoestring. We find at Carbex, when we fund these companies, we give them $3 or $4 million, but we require them to have some cost share. We want to see typically 30% from private other sources. And a number of these companies struggle to find that, right, with us paying 70% of the cost. So we need a healthy early stage pipeline. It is more innovative than the clinical stage pipeline. If we don't fix this with pull incentives, push incentives, there won't be anything there for the pull incentive to apply to. So we need both push and pull as part of the equation here. This slide, there's a lot of things going on in this slide, but over here you can see the time it takes. Really, if we want antibiotics, for in a decade, you should have started 5 years ago. Is the basic thrust of here. Think about all the basic science projects that's required. If the goal at the end of the day is 6 highly effective or high-impact antibiotics per decade, you needed to start at 6,000 basic research projects at universities around the world. 215 hits elite projects, which is where Carbex starts to fund. And then 12 projects that begin clinical efficacy phase 2 studies. It costs a lot of money to do these various elements of the pipeline, okay? The phase 2 studies and phase 3 studies are the most expensive, but they're smaller number. It's a lot of money to get this stuff done. And I could talk about each of these 3, but I'm going to talk about the red sector, which is the one that Carbex works in. So think about this $5.6 million figure we go here. So there's the total investment needs, $5.6 billion. With the help of the data from the Hub, from Leslie's organization, we looked at all of the money that's going in. You can't read this, but Carbex is at the top, and there's lots of private funding still floating around, at least in the past decade. $1.9 billion is the total. There's still a significant gap per decade. In other words, about a $370 million per year gap in the push incentives that are needed within this intermediate phase of development. There's also gaps in the other phases as well. We're just focusing on this one for the moment. Mark is tired of reading reports. I am too, and I've written about half of them or been a participant. As an academic, you're always ready to write another report. I am not ready to write another report. I'm done, right? But all of them have said about the same thing on this one topic. And you can read the slide. And there's a little bit of variation. The older ones say 172, some of them up to 500 million. But we're in the same ballpark. We need additional push incentives to get this thing done. A little bit about Carbex, funded by 4 governments. It used to be 3, but now we're grateful to have Canada joining us as well, and the 2 foundations, Wellcome Trust and Original Founder and the Gates Foundation. So we're non-profit, we're charitable. We take money from foundations, from governments, and then we use it to support so that we have better therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines coming through the portfolio so that the world will have something that we can actually apply for clinical development and for the pull incentives. We've had a remarkable success, and the only thing I'm going to focus on here is 18 projects that have gone into first in human, 12 of those being therapeutics. It would be, if we were a company, I think the largest pipeline of first in human in the world, bigger than all of the big pharma companies. We have, there was a question earlier about what are we targeting? So each of these dots here represents a CARB-X-funded project, if I'm doing that correctly. Let's see. Each of these dots here represents a CARB-X-funded project. Each of those dots would be $3 or $4 million. It depends on the needs of the program. And this is, we've been going since 2016, but this data is from the Graham study, which was published a couple of years ago. And it shows that, the great majority of our programs actually were hitting the syndromes, and there's another slide which I'm not going to show on bacteria, for which the highest mortality around the world is being expressed in that study. The exception is down here at the bottom. There's not much mortality from gonorrhea, but we do have a significant program in research and development of sexually transmitted diseases. Thinking about those 3 stages that were on the pyramid before the funnel, over here you have basic research. There's a lot of actors, right? And over here you have advanced development, and Mark is looking for additional money. But you have HERA, hopefully, and BARDA, which has invested a lot, the AMR Action Fund, GARD-P, various actors here. In our middle space, it's really essentially CARB-X at this moment. There are other players, but many of them are either a little bit before us or actually have exited this space in recent years. You don't get a chain unless all the links work, okay? And that advanced development chain link requires pull incentives to really get that done as well. The basic thrust of the message is that we need both push and pull for us to have anything. There was a question about access, and when do we start that from REACT? And in 2016, I fought to have access, stewardship and access, global stewardship and access to be part of the foundation of CARB-X. Everyone who signed for a grant from CARB-X has agreed to the same language, which commits them to the expiration of the patent to a global program of stewardship and access. Now, this starts at hit the lead, so projects that may have 5 people with the company and they barely left the university. Those stewardship and access plans become public, and more articulated when they get much closer to approval. Okay, so this will begin to happen, but 92 companies are under this contract, and we published this stewardship and access development guidance. It's interesting that one of the 2 companies that the UK signed for a subscription program, Shionogi, had no contractual obligation to do this, but nevertheless gave a voluntary license to GARD-P that was a tremendous step forward in terms of global access for that drug, for cefiderocol, which is fully compliant with what we're asking for, but Shionogi did it voluntarily, not under this contractual obligation. So we think these are reasonable and sustainable because even companies that aren't being required to do it are doing it in the antibiotic sector. Talk about pull incentives. Published research, not only is the research public, but in this super tiny thing down here, which you can't see, but hopefully you'll see the slides at some point, every single bit of data, all of the model, everything is 100% online because I wanted every piece of this model to be fully transparent to everyone. It's been out for a couple of years. I've had minor comments and corrections into it. I think this really remains the best estimate around the world. But what I'm looking for, what I think is sufficient, would be about $310 million worth of global revenue per drug per year for 10 years. Now, you might say, well, $3.1 billion sounds like a lot of revenue, but $310 million a year, can you guess, of all the drugs being sold right now, where would that place it numerically in drugs? I looked last night, the number 200 drug in global sales this year, or 2 years ago when the data was available, is over 800 million, okay? So this would make an amazing new antibiotic, maybe like the 400th best-selling drug on the planet, and this is what we're hoping for, okay? You are not over-reimbursing antibiotics to give them, rewards at this level. In fact, it's way down the list compared to all of the other drugs that are being reimbursed today. But the model establishes the number, and then you look at what other drugs are making, and you're almost embarrassed. A lot of countries are moving forward with this. This is really a G7 project that's made a lot of progress. The United Kingdom has formalized and finalized their program now. It has left the pilot and is now moving into a permanent situation. They've had a public consultation, which closed on October 2nd. A lot of comments came in from across the spectrum. But it is the United Kingdom paying its fair share based on a reasonable proportion within the G7 and the EU 27 for their drugs. Japan announced a pilot during their presidency of the G7. proposals on the table from the Council, from the Commission rather, here in Europe. Joel will talk about Canada's process and in the U.S., the Pasteur Act, which slowly but surely, if you know anything about the U.S. Congress, you know that things don't necessarily happen the way you want them to happen immediately. Okay, but it is making progress. I can assure you of that. How much should each of these G7, if we're going to say that the burden of the cost falls on the G7, how much should that be? And these are also published estimates, and there's the link to the spreadsheets. But you can see the numbers here, and my best estimate for the European Union would be $121 million per year. In other words, Europe would support revenues, whatever they sold, and then you would make it up, a revenue guarantee, to bring it up to $121 million a year. Again, I'd like to know how that would place in Europe. It's not a best-selling drug by any stretch, but this is sufficient to attract some private investment back into the sector so that Mark doesn't have to worry about not being able to fund an excellent drug that is ready for phase 3. So, if we don't do reforms, the R&D ecosystem is collapsing. Nobody gets access if we don't make any new drugs. And all the existing drugs are eventually going to go away because of bacterial evolution and resistance. The ecosystem needs both push and pull. Carbex, I think we've demonstrated since 2017, our first grant was issued in 2017, that these push incentives are working to revitalize their preclinical and phase 1 pipeline. But we have to have something at the other end to catch these things, and that's the pull incentive, so that there's actually a market and an incentive for private investors to come back in. Also want to note that incentives that focus on late-stage R&D and access for low and middle-income countries, things like GARD-P, and I wish I had a better way to say EDCTP3. Surely there's a better way to say that. Advanced ID and Secure, these are also crucial and need to be evaluated and funded as well. Each high-income country pays its fair share. This is an area in which the rest of the world, or at least the low-income world, should be expected to free ride. And that's really what happened with the Shionogi license on an explicit level. And that there's conditionalities. We condition, you don't get money from Carbex unless you agree to our stewardship and access provisions. The same thing should be true for anyone receiving a pull incentive, right? And what Shionogi did upon receiving a pull incentive from England was to do that voluntarily without anyone asking them to do it. I think the rest of the industry certainly could follow.
Thank you for this very convincing talk that we need both push and pull and that funding is still too low. Are there questions?
Thanks so much for that beautiful explanation. A few of us are following what you mentioned in the EU, the discussions around a new pull incentive. It seems to be quite controversial at the moment, so the Parliament look at it and kind of offer a different perspective, also the one that kind of HIRA report. My question is actually on the feasibility side. I heard Mark also, we talked about that before. Of course, having the 27 member states would be better. That's what I understand from you. The other option will require all the member states to get together. But can we also here convince them that they should? In the light of one thing, in your slide, Kevin, you showed that the war is moving into another direction in the pull incentives, or that's my understanding. So most of these other ones are building on a revenue or like trying to, the UK, let's say, model. And that's being piloted, whereas the exclusivity extension voucher is not being piloted. It's a bit uncertain what it's going to cost. It will cost to the national budget, so it's just that you pay later. What are your thoughts on this? Can we do something as a global health community to push for this big pull incentive and not fall into the trap of that the only feasible option is the EU to go together with something unknown and very costly? Thank you.
So it's a great question. I think what's controversial in Europe is not the need for antibiotic pull incentives, but the specific mechanism of how to do it. Hopefully you agree with that. and particularly the voucher, the transferable exclusivity voucher, as opposed to the revenue guarantee or subscription system. You have to note, though, that the UK has a single payer, and so it was easy for them to do a subscription. We'll hear from Canada, it's not a single payer, has a complex provincial and territorial system. They chose a modification of that, of the revenue guarantee. The United States, the PASTEUR Act is more like a revenue guarantee, you know, in its format. It doesn't quite use that language, but it's close to that. And Japan is working out what they're going to do. So countries that have looked at this with some care have figured out a solution that fits their national health system, because everybody's system is different. For Europe, the trick is that the competency for health is obviously at the member state level, and the competency for intellectual property is something that can be done centrally. And so instead of trying to get 27 ministers of health and ministers of finance to line up and to jointly do something similar, you know, it was a expedient idea to have a way to do it once for all of Europe. And that is the political expediency argument behind the voucher. I've written twice about the voucher. Neither article can be considered positive. The first one in 2007. But if it's the only feasible option, or if it's an option that we could do for a short period of years while we phase in the other one, I'm willing to hear discussions of that. So that's my views. Mark might disagree.
No, I think it was very well explained, Kevin, and I just want to add in, because we obviously are working with Brussels also on hopefully a European solution that seems still a distance away. It doesn't matter if subscription or voucher. And actually, I think that's one of the comments. For us working in this field, it really doesn't matter if it's voucher or subscription. What is important is that the numbers are right. And these Kevin illustrated very nicely. And that also means that the voucher, in the end, if designed appropriately, should not cost more or different than actually the subscription model. And I think that whatever the legislator does, if it is the voucher, because it is the only feasible way, there should be enough flexibility for correction if it turns out that the first one or two are really significantly more expensive than expected, which currently, from our knowledge, going really into depths and going far beyond probably this panel here, but we don't think it's actually going to be more expensive than the subscription model. It's just about what can be done in the legislation or in the situation of the 27 individual member states. And what we would be really disadvantages is to have 27 individual models. That is not we can't handle this. I mean, then I would need to double just my workforce to handle the subscription model. I mean, it's not feasible, right? And so we must have a European solution and ideally a US solution. These are the key markets, and we're very grateful for the UK to really lead that whole discussion and for Canada now to joining. I think that's great, but also in terms of moving the needle for the whole field, it's not enough. So we're really grateful that they start.
I would say, Mark, failed to say that we also need a solution quickly. Yes. A perfect solution in 10 years is a disaster for the sector. Because remember my slide, 81% of the people in those 7 companies, plus Novartis, had left 5 years later, had left the field entirely, right? So coming up with a perfect solution in 5 years, I think could be worse. I don't know. It's a terrible idea. We need to act more quickly than that.
Yes, true. For the sake of time, I would say we start now with the final talk. That is from Gel Dennis. He is a public health policy practitioner and Director General at the Public Health Agency of Canada. And he is also leading the Canadian AMR task force. And you decided for a pull mechanism and are going to implement it.
Yes. Yeah. So the three speakers before me were in charge of the doom and gloom part of this discussion, and hopefully I can give you a little bit of some light at the end of some tunnel, but in the end, you'll be the one to decide. Need to point it?
For the pointers here.
No, just there we go. Okay. So yes, we're here to talk about an actual country's experience in dealing with what a lot of Leslie and Mark and Kevin have described. I'm going to focus on, the talk is to focus on what's on the right side, which is some progress that Canada has made over the last couple of years, and I'm happy to talk about that. Which kind of starts back really in 2021, where our AMR task force in Canada was created in the Public Health Agency, and that led then to a mandate commitment for our minister. For those of you that are not in the public health or in the public policy space, this is where the Prime Minister writes a to-do list to ministers and gives them homework that they have to come back on in terms of progress. And so there was a specific commitment from our Prime Minister to address and expedite action on antimicrobial resistance. We translated that into a strategy for our minister, and then translated that into a first initial budget proposal that was mostly for surveillance and additional evidence that then we used to make a greater case for more of a pan-Canadian action plan commitment, and an additional funding proposal that came in 2023. Along the way, we use that same evidence to do both push and pull. So here we did make some investments in the Secure initiative, a very worthwhile initiative in terms of access to LMICs, and I see Peter's here representing GARPI. And then also Carbex, which Kevin eloquently described. We have our action plan that just got approved, in fact, this year. This is an action plan signed off by 14, so all of our jurisdictions, both at the health and agriculture level. So our full focus is not only in the human health space, but also in the agriculture, agri-food, and animal space. So it's not 27 members, Mark, but 14 times 2, my math is still substantive. So. What's equally important with this slide, though, is what comes before all the stuff on the right, which is years and years and years of expertise in the space of AMR. And I don't just mean at the Public Health Agency or in government, but academia and industry. That really created a huge amount of momentum for AMR that allowed us to do what we did. Equally is true on the international side, and here kudos go to a lot of the folks that are here and some of you in the room. I'm thinking of the Global AMR R&D Hub in particular, and Leslie and Kevin and Secure's work and GARPI as well, Peter. These are things that, as well as other countries that are leading in this space, that countries like Canada who are looking to actually make up ground, we're leaning on. And so it just shouldn't be lost that if you're looking to do something in this space, there are friends out there that are willing to help you join the cause, and we've certainly found that to be the case. Okay, so here's the crux of the story. I'm a policy guy. I'm not a public health professional or an industry guy. So when my son, was young and still now asks, what I do for a living, I tell him I tell stories. I tell stories. I tell stories on what we think should be done, what the problem is, who it impacts, and what could be done about it. And so, in that space, our mind constantly works in the what, so what, now what kind of logic. And what I wanted to give you was some of the building blocks that we use to make the case. I heard some folks say, well, so what do we do about this? And Mark, why are politicians or decision makers not doing things? Well, I'll tell you what we did, and then the next slide will tell you some of the questions we got. And it's not as hard probably as creating a new drug, which you're trying to do, but it's not easy either, is my main message. And so really thinking about how you do this, I think is very, very important. Because everybody can read the same stats and facts, and still we are where we are. So there is some issue here that needs to be resolved. And full disclaimer, my view from doing this and talking to others who have done it or are looking to do this, or anything similar on AMR, is you got to do this within your own country's context. Okay, so there's no lift, cut, paste, repeat, that comes from other country strategies. Really, this has to be built in what your own context is. But nonetheless, here you go. Evidence for us was extremely important. 20 years of surveillance in the AMR space had already been done. We were standing on the shoulders of decades of work in terms of what the priorities were, what the pathogens issues were, and where resistance was growing. We had done a Council of Canadian Academies report 2 years before the task force that looked at the actual impact, both from a health point of view and an economic point of view. These were all things that were sitting there that just needed to be actually activated. But there was a lot of work that was happened. In terms of the international evidence as well, again, anybody who's looking to understand this problem from your point of view, I highly recommend you contact Leslie and Ralph at the Hub. A wealth of information. We stood on this for months when we tried to start to make the case within the AMR task force, and then we blew that out to other international organizations like Carbex and others, and industry, which also equally helped make the case. And so, and we looked at evidence that was maybe not what you would typically see when you come to AMR sessions with AMR people. We looked for comparatives about other things that would kind of contrast the issue and the investment. For us in Canada, it's opioids and suicide prevention, two major issues in Canada with a lot of investment. But when you look at the actual health impacts, and certainly on the death side, AMR bypasses these. And this is not to compete issues. These are all bad things and all need the right amount of attention and funding. But it's just to highlight an issue that doesn't really get that kind of limelight as opposed to some of these other issues. So we spent quite a bit of time on that. In terms of framing the issue, we looked at it from a variety of different perspectives. You've seen a couple of the perspectives here in the presentations. So the public health angle was quite obvious from the Public Health Agency. We started from here. 26 of infections in Canada are face resistance right away. We also have only access to 3 out of the 18 last approved new drugs. This is an embarrassing fact for a country like Canada. I think it's embarrassing for any country, but we take particular exception to that and are looking to change that statistic. 5,400 Canadians die directly as a result of resistance every year. Again, when we contrast that to some of the other issues, it was quite shocking. The economic impact, equally, we made sure that we understood that, and we're highlighting that. $1.4 billion to the healthcare system cost every year, $200 million to the agriculture sector. I'll come to that in a minute. Canada is a very highly dependent agriculture exporter, and so that's an angle that's important, not only for the animals, but from the economic side. And another $2 billion hit on our GDP. So these kinds of numbers from an economic point of view also started to resonate. The socioeconomic impact, we also took a look at which groups are really being impacted by this. We had a 57% increase in inappropriate use in long-term care facilities, so the elderly. We started to look at that and what was underpinning it. In terms of maternal child health, 75% of prescriptions are for women in Canada, and in our Indigenous populations. And this is a different access angle. It's one that's sadly more equivalent with LMICs than it is with the rest of Canada. It's not that they're lacking access to the next available new drug. They're lacking access to drugs that exist, period, that exist in other places in Canada and elsewhere that are not available in remote and rural areas for Indigenous populations. And so this is a different access issue that we're facing. We looked at the pandemic link, and here, we looked at this from 3 types of scenarios. One is the one you hear a lot, which is, what if the next pandemic is not viral, it's bacterial? Okay, fair enough. At the further end of the spectrum, maybe to the right, in terms of nightmare scenarios, you've got a deliberate man-made type pathogen from a bacterial. Okay, higher impact probably, but less likely. But the other end of the spectrum that doesn't get talked about a lot, which you think is much more of significance, is secondary infections, and those we saw during COVID, and we don't highlight those enough in terms of the impacts and the cost. So these were just different types of frames that we actually used to come at the issue, frankly, because we wanted to have different facets to it, but also to speak to different audiences, which is the next point. Oh, sorry. I can't go back. You can't get there from here on the computer. Oh, magical. Okay. Making it personal, and this should have framed maybe a little bit differently. More about knowing your audience. From the government point of view, really knowing the government agenda. This is something that I've done in other spaces, but talking about it just in the public health space using public health language works only to a certain extent. Talking about it in terms of different types of agenda, it resonates as well. So for us, there's a large healthcare agenda, and so really putting in contrast how we're spending a lot of money to improve healthcare, but yet healthcare is being undermined by the lack of effectiveness of key tools. And so how does that make sense? If you're going to spend a lot of money to improve the system, but then you've got the resistance that's undermining those same efforts. And so we tried to map to as many different government agenda issues as possible. We also took a look at, from a finance point of view, and here we hooked in a lot to the international agenda. Our finance minister, who sits on G20, also who's hearing the same type of message from AMR. And so we were looking to see how many different types of ministerial agendas we could tack into. A bio-life science agenda got us going on the industry side. And so we were able to kind of expand that out as well. Our minister was an economist at the time. And so the market failure piece, the cost benefit is really where we spent a lot of time as well. And then we shifted from theory to reality. And what I mean here is trying to make this as real as possible for decision makers so that they could try to understand. And so we did a lot of case studies. We talked about UTIs and the impact on maternal health. We talked about the resistance in long-term care facilities and the impact there. We highlighted companies, statistics that we worked with industry on, the number of companies, even some of them, Mark, that went the complete distance, got regulated, et cetera, and then literally pulled out of the market. So they were right there, but it wasn't profitable enough to market and stay, and so they left. And so getting these stories out really kind of resonated as well. Mark, your question as to why the heck governments aren't doing anything? Well, here's just a small list of questions we got along the way. I'm going to focus in on one. I'm happy to tell questions on the others. Why now? Why now? Why do governments need to do this now? Can't we wait for more evidence? Shouldn't we wait for more countries to jump in? Won't the multilateral system, WHO will solve this, right? Why do we need to do anything? There's only a few countries doing this. Do we really want to be on the cutting edge? Bleeding edge? Really? Do we want to do that? How does this, we're tired of the pandemic. Can you go away? This is another doom and gloom. We just got over. Why? Right? So, I'm being, a bit facetious, but not really. These are real questions that decision makers have when they're trying to look at an investment. And they have many choices of where to put the money. And the money is not going this way. It's going different ways. And that's not just a Canadian thing. And so, really coming back to the impact and the costs. Coming back to, from our point of view, there was a lot of credibility at stake as well. G7, we had made commitments. We had, from our Auditor General, this is like the big kind of critiquer in government policy in Canada, had already said we weren't doing enough. We were at the bottom of the list of the G7 in terms of funding and access. These aren't happy things for government. And so trying to find, if you don't do anything, you're certainly not going to address any of these aspects. And also pointing to the opportunity. What does it actually give the government in terms of a niche area or a new area of leadership or investment that they would want to be taking up? So for us, there were a lot of parallels with the pandemic that resonated. Maybe that's just a timing issue. So I worry about countries that try to do this as some of the memories of COVID actually wane. But that helped us out a lot. And the international agenda as well. I still remember the very first meeting we encouraged our minister to go to when he was named to the post was the WHA. And it's amazing, ministers coming back from international conversations, hearing a lot of the things that they hear about back home, but they hear it differently and they hear it from different interlocutors. And that creates momentum. It creates consensus in terms of needing to take action. So these were just some of the barriers and some of the questions, and some of them took a lot longer than others to answer. Getting to yes isn't enough. Staying there is just as hard, or maybe harder, and certainly not something maybe we anticipated as hard And I would recommend thinking about earlier on than when you actually get to yes. There's a lot of effort that goes into actually getting a yes to a pull incentive or any other investment, frankly, on AMR. But the money is just getting you away there. Then you actually have to keep it on the agenda because often it's not uncommon for governments to think, well, we announced it and we funded it, so it's fixed, right? Well, that's not really how this works. So, let's actually talk about how it stays on the agenda and what we need to be doing. It's not a one and done process. And so keeping the same drive that you have when you're actually pitching the idea to actually implementing the idea can take a lot of energy. And execution matters. Once you actually get the commitment, showing that there's progress in moving and delivering creates confidence. And confidence helps keep momentum. But looking at the very concrete things about implementing this is where we are now in terms of identifying the unmet need criteria. What will we actually identify? The valuation process, the procurement process, the distribution process. In Canada, as Kevin mentioned, it's a decentralized process with the provinces and territories. So already starting those conversations. Are we going to have a manufacturer supply direct kind of model? Is the Canadian government going to hold this stuff somewhere? Is there going to be a regional pre-positioning? Is it going to go directly to the hospitals? These sound like small issues, but you have to figure them out. And we have to figure them out with 14 governments. And so, everything from the procurement to the supply chain is really where you need to spend some time in terms of implementing at the end of the day. So I think I'll pause there. I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of some of the thought processes that we went to, some of the back and forth with decision makers and some of the considerations. But really trying to broaden the conversation is what we did from different lenses and evidence base outside of what would maybe be what we kind of hear typically as far as the public health space, and certainly out of what often comes with things like the pull incentives, which is focus on the product and the pipeline. And we tried to do as much as we could to add about the people who were being impacted and what would actually happen to the people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the stimulating talk. Are there questions?
Hi. Am I on? Yeah. Great, really, really great panel. First of all, thanks. It's so refreshing to see every sector lining up and really talking in parallel about this, whether it's I'm going to say, Leslie, you're sort of NGO, maybe that's not right, private sector, public sector and academics, all saying the same things, really good. Secondly, Joel, fabulous presentation, and congratulations on getting to, I don't know if this is the beginning of the end or the start of the, anyway, you've got over the start line, that's for sure, which is brilliant. I'd love to hear, I have two questions briefly. One, Joel, with the question that came from someone about Europe, how do you see can you give any advice in terms of managing this multi-governmental sort of process in addition to what you already said? And then secondly, if I may, to the whole panel, what would you like to see, what's the opportunity that we have next year at the UNGA high-level meeting on AMR? September next year, we have 11 months, what should we all be doing between now and then and looking to get out of that?
Thanks for the question. Like I said at the beginning, I think every jurisdiction's contexts are different, and while there's a federated model in principle, in Europe, it's not the same as in Canada. So it works differently. There's different roles and responsibilities. There's different functions. So there's different considerations. So I wouldn't propose to give much advice other than just share our experience of what has occurred, and certainly that engagement is absolutely key. We couldn't have done what we did without the buy-in and engagement, not just of provinces and territories, but industry and other stakeholders. So I'm not sure I have much to say there. In terms of UNGA, there's a lot of discussions going on around UNGA. A lot of learning, I think, from the 3 high-level meetings that just occurred, both in terms of process and hopes and dreams of what might come out. My personal hope is that we could get to something very practical very practical. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot that's been happening. This is, I mean, notwithstanding the issues that still occur, there's been a lot that's been going on since the last high-level meeting. Perhaps not as coordinated as it should be or as focused as it should be. And so maybe that's the opportunity. We'd like to see some conversation around targets. I think if we don't know what we're aiming for, I have no idea how we're going to measure progress. So maybe in the access or the R&D space, this would be something that the community could kind of galvanize around and identify what exactly is it that we're aiming for, and then and measure it and see how much progress we can get. Thank you.
We're just 1 minute, so many questions, but brief questions, brief answer, please. Okay.
I'll be very quick. Thank you very much. I have a list of questions, but I'll be very, very
just one.
It's here. So simply, I was not from Kevin. Kevin, you mentioned like health systems are different, and so do should be our tactics as well to tackle this issue. So do you think that it's time to look at the similarities in market failures between AMR and vaccines, for example? And since we've been talking a lot about pandemic treaty, can we look at that similarities and build on it? That's one thing. For example, we could take this case to CEPI. A lot of success stories have been happened from the COVID. Can we build on that and just move a bit in AMR? That's one thing. Second thing, back to you, Joel, when you said you like to say stories. Can we tell the story from different narrative, looking at the market failures, for example, and try to understand more about the role of big pharma in the market failures? And I can just give a brief. In Scandinavian countries, they have a very low level of AMR, and this is mainly due to a high regulatory system and the rigid system to register any new drugs in comparable to other low-middle income countries. Thank you. I think I made my points.
I think like Meredith and Tolstoy, unhappy Meredith, right? The AMR and the vaccines are broken in different ways. That for vaccines, there's largely positive externalities. The more people we vaccinate, the better for the whole population. For AMR, it's probably the opposite, at least for unnecessary or low value utilization. And so the economics are really flipped, and so they are both broken, but it's really quite different, I'm sorry to say.
I mean, the only thing I'll say about others will know more about the technology and how it aligns, but I think from a policy point of view, looking at how issues are connected is rarely a bad thing. And a vertical look at an issue it only gets you so far. And so certainly in the global health agenda, I mean, somebody said this is the only AMR session. Okay. So, but the global health agenda has a lot of momentum behind it. So what I take as a positive is, so where are the different maybe aspects where we can actually hook into either TB or pandemic preparedness and try to create space? It's not easy, but, and it's not an either or. I think you need to do both the vertical and the horizontal, but I'm not sure we do enough of the horizontal.
So I'm very sorry. I was told we have to stay on time. And but you are welcome to come in front and discuss also in the break. So I have to close the session. I thank you for the great presentation, for the stimulating discussion, and I will tell the organizers that we need at least 3 sessions next year. Thank you.